So today we have four fantastic panelists to share their insights with you. Our host is Diana Lind, who's NewCities Senior Fellow for Housing. There's Dr. Jonathan Witzel from McKinsey Global Institute, Eugene Jones from the Atlanta Housing Authority, and Angela Herlock from the Chicago Housing Authority. Diana, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to the panel for joining us here today. This is a very important topic to be talking about at this moment with COVID-19, particularly as people have been told to shelter in place at a time when some people don't have a home to shelter in. And also a lot of people are facing a loss of income and are having trouble paying their rent or their mortgages. This is also coming at a time on a backdrop of a housing crisis that was already in motion. And it's also a moment when potentially there are new solutions that could be put forward as we enter this uncharted territory and try to think of new ways of addressing the housing crisis and the housing challenges that we had already faced before this pandemic. So I'm really pleased to have this panel here, and I thought I would just sort of kick it off with a general question of asking how your organizations are responding to COVID-19. In particular to Angela and Eugene from Chicago and Atlanta respectively, sort of how are you, what new programs are you rolling out as a result of the pandemic, and how are you coordinating with either local, state, or federal agencies? What kind of funding sources are you finding for your work? So perhaps Angela, you want to go first, Eugene, and then Jonathan.
Sure, thank you so much. So we've been working with our city and kind of in a regional nature to look at how housing needs to remain an important focus for those who've been affected, not only by COVID-19, but just in general, right? So we've been working with the city on a weekly basis to make sure that we understand what opportunities are out there. We've heard a lot about trying to ease the plight of people and the stress of families that are in our housing. And so quite recently, we did a series of things. We have eased the pain on rent coming in. So people have a stay on rent. That doesn't mean that they don't have to pay it, but they don't have to come out and put themselves at risk at this point in time. And so when the shelter in place is over, we're not going to hold it against people if they've not been able to come out and pay their rent at this point in time. We've also really cautioned people to try to protect themselves and remain healthy, right? To stay indoors. We've been having our partners around our services, residential services, making sure that we're checking on residents and trying to keep them as aware as possible as the things that are available to them. Of course, we've done the things like all other developments have done. We've asked people to not congregate in public places and things like that. But we are of the utmost concern to make sure that families, while their lives are being interrupted, they're being kept safe.
Great, thank you. Eugene?
I mean, pretty much the same as what Angela has talked about. We do 100% wellness checks in our high rises and so forth to make sure that everyone's where they're supposed to be. Whomever's in the hospital, we know. Of course, because of the HIPAA laws, they can't tell specifically who tested positive or negative for coronavirus, but we try to do the best that we can. We make that communications with our residents, our employees, and also our coordination with our great mayor here in the city of Atlanta and also the governor here. We look for partners, our social partners who are providing food, transportation, also making sure that those individuals that need dialysis that get their attention and so forth. And so that coordinated effort, working with our social service agencies and so forth, and making that commitment that we're going to be doing this, we're going to be trying to find an opportunity to test all of our residents, and that's going to be a big duty in itself because we need mobile accessibility because a lot of these residents, these seniors who are most vulnerable, cannot leave their units. And so how do we get to them and get them tested and so forth, so we at least know where we're at and so forth, and how can we assist them, how can we help, and bubble that up through the city strategy and also through the governor's office.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, would you like to add from McKinsey's perspective?
Well, we're working with, I think, about over 80 cities, states, and some countries around the world on two aspects, really. One is around coordinating relief, standing up nerve centers to address people experiencing homelessness, to mobilize resources across the healthcare system. And also, of course, on the economic recovery, thinking through what are the programs that can be put in place to safeguard livelihoods now and to bring back economic activity in line with public health requirements. So, yeah, that's going on around the world, and of course, many important cities in the U.S. as well.
Great. So those are some immediate responses. I'm curious to know how you see this pandemic sort of playing out in the long term. So Angela, you mentioned staying rent for a period of time. You know, it's possible that this will go on for 12 to 18 months, that will, you know, we won't return to normal. And I sort of wonder, you know, what does that mean for, you know, a housing authority and your renters, and for, you know, the cities that you're working in?
Yeah, I think, you know, everyone's taking it day by day, right? We're putting in measures as greater and deeper measures are needed. And so looking at 12 and 18 months out, we don't have the answer to that. We are still, you know, day by day putting things in place. We'd hope that we wouldn't all be sheltered in 18 months, but that is the pure fact. It may actually happen. Also, though, as a part of like a regional team too, we're understanding that if this affects not only those in our units, but also those who are trying to access the units, right? So as we're trying to process families to get into those units, that is not ceasing nor stopping. We're still trying to make sure that families can get assessed and get into units that have been allocated for them.
Sure. I don't know if either Eugene or Jonathan, you want to add something of kind of how you might shift from the day-to-day to the future.
So let me just make sure that we're all on the same page. First of all, before the pandemic, we were never normal because of the lack of funding, sufficient funding from HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and all the other resources that we have to tap in. You know, we were already in the crux. Everyone's still asking for housing. Can I get a Section 8 voucher, a housing choice voucher? How can I get in public housing and so forth? And so now, because of this pandemic, it's just going to escalate even further. There may be more homelessness. There may be more people with losing their homes, foreclosure. They can't pay rent. Beyond the June, July dates, how's that going to affect housing? It seems like we're never, ever at the top of the list when it comes to a political campaign, when it talks about transportation, education, and healthcare. Housing is always an aftermath, but housing is the most important aspect of every American in this country. We need a roof over our head in order to protect the people, families, and also to lessen the homelessness crisis that we have on the streets all over the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that housing has not gotten the attention it needs, either at the, you know, federal campaign level or at, you know, the local or state level.
We always talk a good game, Diana, but no one puts their feet to the fire, and it's just not it's a crisis now, and everyone sees it, and everyone understands the depth and the knowledge that housing authorities provide to this city. Now they understand. Now, what we need to sit there and learn from this and look at where's the opportunity for a housing authority to better serve the communities, to better serve the mayors and the governors of our state.
Absolutely. So I was going to just call on you, Jonathan, because I know that you've studied a lot on some of the causes of the housing crisis and produced some research on some of the potential solutions for affordable housing. Curious to know what you think will be the impact on housing from the pandemic, and especially in terms of on the supply side, when construction has been stalled and, you know, a lot of housing can't get built right now.
Okay, well, I first of all want to just second what Eugene was saying. I mean, this is just, yes, more crisis. I mean, housing has been in crisis for a decade plus. I mean, ever since we started defunding it back in the 80s and 90s. So, I mean, I think this is like more of the same. So thank you very much. But, you know, that doesn't take away the urgency. And in a very, you know, economic kind of point of view, that when you're running a consumer economy and you're killing the consumer, it's really bad. You know, and we were economically killing the consumer before. Now we're possibly physically killing them. That's not, you know, that isn't called success. I mean, that is something we need to turn the ship around 180 degrees and steam in the other direction. And I just hope that this is a big enough wake-up call to say, realize, as Eugene and to say, you know, a house is more than it's a physical asset. It's your actual stake in society, you know, that enables everything else to happen. So if we don't start with funding that, well, you know, we're going to reap the consequences of it. So, I mean, this has been in crisis for a long time. In LA, I think the interesting thing is that, you know, this point about construction, I look out my window, I can still see construction going on some luxury high rises. Actually, you know, that it is possible to construct. I mean, I think there are, and LA, for example, has proven that it can build. I mean, it has actually made its housing total housing needs assessments over the last 5 years. What it has not proved is that it can build affordable. So there is a very specific gap here in the marketplace, is that the market is not delivering on affordable housing. And that is something that has to be done through changing the rules of the game. I mean, it's the definition of insanity to continue to do something and expect a different result, right? So, you know, it's the system is kind of set up to not produce affordable. So I'm actually on the other side of this, saying that, yeah, no, this is you've now brought it into really sharp relief. There are a lot of people who can't pay the rent, who don't have housing. Isn't it about time to do something about this? Aren't we going to figure this out? Because, I mean, continuation of the current situation would be exactly as you said, no housing. I mean, that is actually the status quo. The status quo is not to deliver housing. That is what the system is set up to do, at least not to deliver affordable housing. So now is the time to change that. I hope this is the prompt, is the urge to get people to realize that this is actually, if you will, there's an opportunity here, and the opportunity is to change the rules to build affordable housing.
So Donna, can I piggyback on what Jonathan just stated?
Absolutely.
And you're right, Jonathan. Affordable, I'm not sure what affordable means to this day. Unless we sit there and try to reduce building materials, labor, land costs, and environmental, we're never going to get there. I don't care who, whatever they say, it's not going to happen. Now, can we reduce building materials? Maybe so. Can we reduce labor? Probably not. Can we reduce land costs? No. And environmentals? No. And so that if we don't cut the red tape somewhere, we're still not going to be able to afford whatever they call affordable housing. Builders are building, money, access to resources and so forth, so they can build those things, but they cannot make affordable housing affordable. And that means, you know, who's that? Is that the workforce? Is that the people who work at the McDonald's, Burger Kings, and so forth? What affordable to them is quite different from what affordable is to me and Jonathan, Angela, and everyone on this panel.
I think those are some good points. You know, something that I have studied a lot is ways in which to kind of get around some of those costs through things like accessory dwelling units. So like the house and the land is already a sunk cost. Could you build accessory dwelling units to build more housing that way? More multi-generational living, more co-living, other opportunities beyond sort of the single family home. Those might be ways of creating more affordable housing. I'm kind of curious to know whether those are options that you all have, you know, thought about or would see any kind of relevance to your work.
Well, we think about it all the time, but it's a financing factor. Angela and I can tell you, we want to build more affordable housing. We want to build more mixed income, but putting that package together, how we finance those deals, and then we have to go through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development because we have compliance issues, we have environmental issues and so forth. We have to have sign-offs and so forth. And so it takes, people wonder why can't we build more mixed income developments quicker, but it's just the laboring process. We have to put the finance together. It has to be approved. We have to get the city to buy into it. We have to get tax credits. If there's a tax credit proposal, there's a bunch of red tape. It takes us 2 to 3 years to finally, from start to finish, to start building something. And then it takes us another 24 months to come to fruition. There's got to be ways in which we can cut corners.
Well, I mean, I think that that's certainly the way it works in usual conditions. I've noticed that as a result of the pandemic, a lot of cities have developed new ways of housing the homeless, for example. You know, all of a sudden, hotels are now being used to house the homeless, or other buildings. You know, it's predicted that this is going to, the pandemic is going to increase poverty rates. it probably will then have an impact on homelessness. Curious to know if you are seeing any interesting ideas or are yourselves deploying ways of kind of reacting quickly to house more people.
So I'll answer there. And I know in Chicago, there's been a couple things that have been happening of late. For example, as part of a city collaborative, the YMCA has been housing homeless individuals to get them off the street and be able to give them a safe, healthy environment to be in. And then there are also are some nonprofits that have been working on, one actually just started this past week, working on being able to have their first ever positive COVID-19 individuals, homeless individuals, providing space for them, because part of it is getting them off the street. Part of it is still creating this kind of safe environment where they can still do social distancing, right? And so those are some of the things that we're definitely seeing. And I think more is going to come, but also kind of related back to what Jean said earlier, there have to be more players in this conversation, right? So it's not just a housing authority conversation. It's not just a nonprofit development issue. It is everyone. How are we housing those workers that need to come out? How are we housing those individuals that make our economy running on half speed, but still run, right?
Yeah, and I'm going to build on that. Just, I mean, I totally agree with Angela saying, I mean, it is a whole of society response. I mean, if you don't get, I mean, I don't think that first of all, people haven't been real about the numbers for a long time. I mean, just to give us a sense. If
I agree with you there.
Yeah, if you're going to build the affordable housing that's in the Los Angeles Regional Housing Needs Assessment over the next 8 years, that's $130 billion worth of housing. Now, I haven't seen $130 billion worth of public funding in a really long time in anything related to housing. I don't think that number is happening. So you've got to start thinking about, well, where is that money going to come from? And, you know, how can we change the rules, change the system, get rid of the red tape? And we sort of basically have three things. So unlock the land, lower the cost, find the money. You know, so unlock the land. I mean, there is actually a lot of land that's out there. It's just being occupied by somebody, usually very wastefully, underutilized. There's a lot of opportunity to redevelop. We got to take use of the key asset of a city is its land. I mean, that's what it is. It's land that is being used by people. How are we going to change the rules on how they use the land? And yeah, I mean, looking at you, NIMBY, right? So, I mean, these are the issues. You talk about ADUs, that kind of goes with the grain because it says, okay, you got the land. We just want to actually give you guys an incentive to do more with it. That's great. Now, could you make that affordable? That would be cool too. You know, and, you know, if you go on top of that to look at, you know, transit obviously is a big deal. So we're going to have to reinvent transit, but you know, we're not talking in, again, most densities in urban America, we're not talking Manhattan here, right? You know, we're just adding 20%, 30%, all of us on top of, you know, a 2-story building or something like that. You're building up to 4. This is amazingly, you know, you're doubling your capacity, right? So just with not very much. So that's a big thing on the land side. On the cost side, I mean, yeah, the permitting takes 60 months if you have an environmental review challenged single family home, you know, let alone multifamily, 60 months. I mean, who's going to do that in California? So we clearly have process abuse here. I mean, and so it's kind of getting past, well, we've got legacy structures. We've also got kind of the way we build a building is the same way, you know, that we've done it for 30 years. So why can't we start thinking about, you know, as we've talked about prefab and modular for decades and co-living and micro units and you know, there's lots of innovation that we don't use in the housing sector. You talk about this sometimes and you get people's blank eyes. They didn't know. I mean, like there's actually education work. But it's the idea that you can, you know, bend the curve on the costs, you can unlock that land, and then you go out and you find the money. And I think the money actually comes from the idea that there is, you know, the magical words, you know, are set-asides, you know, set-asides. That if you can sort of tell people that you're going to build something that's market rate, but you also are going to, you require them to build affordable as part of it, and that it's not optional, and that it is, you know, and it is going to be part of the system. Then you mobilize the private sector. I mean, you get the private sector to be involved. So I kind of think those are some of the ideas. Last point, the magical words actually in terms of getting things done in California is ministerial or by right, as in this is special, as in housing is special. It gets to go faster, you know, and it creates its own, you know, process that is fast tracked so you do get, you're not ignoring things. It's not like we want to throw CEQA out under the bus. We just don't want it to take 24 months to do an environmental study. We want it done in 90 days. Then you can actually develop. So make it by right, make it ministerial, unlock the land, lower the cost, find the money.
So speaking of finding the money, I think we're at round 4 of stimulus packages this week. Why hasn't there been more of a focus on housing? And what would you like to see in future stimulus packages that would address housing?
That it comes directly to the practitioners to move their money through the less red tape that we have to go through, just like Jonathan was talking about the environmental. Give us the money directly and let us make those inroads. We know what needs to be done. We know how to coordinate and so forth. So give us that money directly. We'll still have to comply with all the different regulations and so forth, but take out the middleman and let us direct those resources so we can prove and show to our communities and so forth that we can get this job done quicker, faster, and in a hurry. When you're sitting there looking at a development that's going to cost you $160 million and you're trying to find out how you're going to finance that, that's a tough one because that's what takes so long for us to develop. If we get that money directly, if we have a $164 million project, leverage whatever we can leverage and get that money to the table and get it financed and get it built, it'll be much, much quicker, faster outcome. We'll be able to show a tangible result instead of just saying that we're getting ready to build something that's going to take us 36 months to go from start to finish. Environmental is a big thing. What Jonathan said, 24 months. You cannot sit around waiting for 24 months to build something when you need the urgency is now. As we had stated before the pandemic, we had a crisis before the pandemic, and now the crisis has exploded, and they're leaving it up to housing authorities to sit there and say, how do we create more housing and so forth? How do we use our available resources with or less and so forth? And how do we get the practitioners at the table and let us plead to the congressional staff and so forth and say, hey, we have an alternative. Our trade associations are doing what they can do and so forth, but our practitioners at the table explaining to them what the need is and how to cut the red tape would probably be a better an opportunity for us to get in the resources that we need to provide affordable housing, whatever that is, and also protect the homeless population.
I think also locally, there's opportunities to have local government to do some creative things. Here in Chicago, our Department of Housing actually set aside, I want to say 2,000 vouchers that represent $1,000 a piece that are going to families to be able to house them. And so those are going to families to be able to use to pay for their rent, which in turn then allows the landlord to pay their mortgage, right? And so it's a ripple effect. And so I think that thinking creatively on every level of government like that, of how you can get the money out to the families that are in need and how it becomes a trickle effect on the whole economy is going to be very important.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, Angela, but we still keep pecking at the issue about affordable housing. We're always, 2,000 is great. You could say we probably need 10,000 and it's still not going to be enough. And so we keep pecking at it, but we never get to the plateau and say, here, we got it. We can manage what we manage. Where it peaks, we can start going down and say, hey, look, we can cover all those bases. I'm not going to say never, but that's the hardest opportunity because we just don't have enough. And people look to us and say, hey, how come you can't do more? How come you can't do more? It's Congress. We plead and plead and plead, but housing is never at the top of anyone's agenda, from Congress to the political apparatus that we have in this country, ever.
Do you want to add anything on that, Jonathan, in terms of, how could federal funding better support housing?
Well, we've been cutting back on federal funding, as said, for decades now. And so, I think reversing that will be the main thing that we're saying. And so whether it's done directly through tax credits or through block grants or directly to the authorities themselves, I think all of the above are going to be necessary here. As I said, this is not, this is not something that happened overnight. I think we can use the moment to accelerate a return. And so I do like the conversation of housing as a right. Just says, and that's sometimes the way America solves the problem is through the legal process. And just, and so, you sue people if they're not providing housing. that would, I think, generate, some level of channeling those funds in the right direction. But yeah, I mean, we need all of the above. I mean, I just think that, right now it costs $130,000 you have to have income of $130,000 to afford median income, to have affordable rent in Los Angeles. So $3,000 is what the average single bedroom rent, apartment goes for. That's affordable to somebody who makes $130,000. So that's, basically, 60% of the population doesn't have affordable. So it's not like, a portion. It's like everybody basically. And so I think at that level, you're sort of saying, okay, structural change, right? It's not a line item here. You could take it from the income side. I would say that, there's another thing here about how do we lift incomes, because it's absolutely part of this, that median incomes have been stagnating for 2 decades while rents have been rising. So yeah, that's the way the math works. But, at this point, if we want to solve the problem for people who are getting kicked on the street, you got to pay them. I mean, you just got to pay them. You got to pay the people, and you got to pay the developers, and you got to pay the authorities. So, I mean, I'm all in, all of the above.
So I'm noticing that there are a couple of good questions that are coming over our Q&A, and I wanted to get to a couple of them. One that came in early from actually the chat was an interesting question about partnering with the private sector that might have, I mean, you mentioned about unlocking the land. A lot of private sector companies have land right now that, whether it's, buildings that are not being used and so on. Is there a way of partnering with private sector companies to build the housing to house essential workers, or to, just to house people?
We do that all the time, Diana. We work with the private sector and so forth. But let's be real. When a private developer comes in, he's looking, or she's looking at what the housing authority can put in the kettle instead of them putting more equity in the deal. It's like, well, okay, housing authority, you have capital dollars of your MTW agency, moving to work agency, you have fungibility with your funding and so forth. What are you gonna put in the table? We give you land, we give you a ground lease, we put some capital dollars in it, but it's still not enough. And the developers are not gonna put more equity in the deal because they just don't wanna do that. They're looking at the federal government to help. Now, there are some developers who have come to the table, we work out a deal and so forth, and we get those built. But there is a compliance issue. HUD, when we buy land and when we make these connections with the developers, there's a long process that we have to abide by, because these are public dollars, taxpayers' dollars that we have to abide by. And we do it as much as we can. Any developer comes to us with a deal and so forth, we look at it, we see if we can partner and so forth. Sometimes, most of the times we can, sometimes we can't. We can provide vouchers, home flex dollars, all those types of things that we have those resources. We try to make that deal happen based on what we can do and so forth. And Angela can say the same thing in Chicago. That's what they do. We work with those partners. We work with the city. We work with the state. We bring all those together. That's why we have good partnerships and good relationships. But it's just not enough. We're pecking at the order. We'll have 2 or 3 deals a year, and then we have 2 or 3 deals next year. If we had all the resources, we can pump out affordable housing, lots of units every year.
Yeah. Yep. I would have to, piggybacking on what Jean just said, it's not enough and it's not fast enough, right? Like, we have deals here in Chicago. We have a history of being able to do co-locations, as you well know, co-locations with other important things, whether it's stores, whether it's libraries, whether it's other amenities that make up for healthy neighborhoods. But it's still, anything that we decide on today is not going to get built for how long from now? So it's not going to be something that's going to be immediately ready for families that are in need right now. So it's a long-term thought process. Yes, bring in the private sector, continuing to bring in the private sector to be able to co-locate things and be able to add their resources, us add our resources together. But it's not something that's immediately going to be able to fix anything today, I would say.
Yeah, a couple more thoughts. I mean, I think, again, in LA, we've had about the housing authorities and various public funding has been able to produce a couple thousand units of affordable housing a year for the last, 5-6 years. And, great, terrific. We now have 60,000 homeless and, and we have, 1 million people, literally 1 million, who are rent burdened. So, I mean, like 2,000 million, right? Big gap. So that, I think just says this is not going to change. I mean, So under 6 cycle regional housing need assessments, you've got a basic, the next wave of targets. That number 2,000 is supposed to go up to somewhere between 15 and 20,000. Now, you don't get a 8 to 10x improvement by just working harder. We have to work differently, and that's where we're going to have to think about unlocking the power, of the people who can do the work. And I include the house, of course, obviously, public housing authorities have been doing this for decades, so they do know how to do it. I refer back to the burdens that have been placed on them. So if you look at the measure, Triple H created an incentive. LA taxpayer voted $1 billion for housing, and it came in at $600,000 a unit. That's just really too expensive. I mean, that's what the system has ladled onto that cost, is $600,000 per unit. So, it's going to have to go, in addition to all the hard work that everybody has and will continue to do. We're going to have to find new models. We're going to have to do that. And I think there are new models. I think that you have already mentioned a couple of them. The thing that really has taken off in LA again is Triple J, the transit-oriented communities, where essentially saying, okay, these areas are, again, special. We're going to allow this to happen in a special way. It's going to happen faster. It's not going to go through the neighborhood planning process. We're going to tell you what we expect, and if you give us what you expect, we're going to let you do it. That has resulted in 4,000 or 5,000 units being built over the last 18 months, so in addition to the 2 that was built before. So I think that's a new rule. I think the ADUs is also a new rule. ADUs, just for relevance, it's not that affordable. I mean, ADUs are good for like moderate income, but it doesn't really get you to house the very, very low income. And obviously, it hasn't been used to house homeless at this point, so, or people experiencing homelessness. So I think there are a lot of models that need to be tried. I see micro units is coming up a lot. I mean, I think that is definitely something that people are going to look at. Co-living spaces. Code doesn't allow you to do co-living in a lot of places. They say, if you define your apartment by the number of bedrooms, well, a 5-bedroom shared living then is 5 apartments, and with that you have 5 parking spaces and 5 degrees of setbacks, and 5 of every piece of infrastructure you want, which just makes it impossible, uneconomic to build. That's to change the code to say, well, this is a new format. It should have its own code, and it shouldn't have a code. It should have safety requirements. But all of the stuff that we've loaded onto it from 30 years of housing, 70 years of housing is like, well, let's catch up. And jurisdictions around the world are doing that. I mean, I got to say, the U.S. is not in the forefront here. If you want to look at where housing is actually getting built, that's not here. There are other cities.
Well, you mentioned micro units and co-housing, and perhaps I can combine 2 questions from the Q&A here to address both of those issues. So one of the questions asks, how can we reframe the conversation where density is being disparaged? So, right now, obviously, people are trying to keep their distance, and we're sort of seeing people feel like multifamily buildings are unsafe as a result. Additionally, there's a question about how co-housing solutions will be impacted. So co-housing or co-living, dorms, any places where amenities are shared. So I wondered if you could sort of address both of those questions, both in terms of, how do we reframe density as being a good thing in many ways, and it is also, still a good thing even in these kinds of situations, and then also, how do you see the impact of coronavirus on, living situations where people are sharing lots of amenities?
Well, 20 or 30 years ago, because of the high rises in Chicago and other places around this country, we found that just didn't work. The resources was not there. We couldn't provide the maintenance to the units and so forth because of the unsafe conditions and so forth. Density works in Toronto. When I was in Toronto, it works well. Now, after this pandemic and so forth, it's going to be an issue about the closeness of everyone who is sharing the same type of resources, community space, swimming pools, and so forth. That may have to be rethinked. When I was in Toronto, you don't build sprawl. It's up in the air. You got to build units. You got to build 1,000, 1,500 units and call it a day and feed everything. here in the United States, we got away from density because of the Cabrinis and all the other different ugly structures that we had. It wasn't anyone's fault of the housing authorities because we had a lack of resources and how we had to manage those properties and a clientele, which we were trying to get, the gangbangers out and so forth. I don't have to tell anyone that it's not true and so forth, but trying to manage all that, we just gotten away from those high rises and so forth. I think there's still work. It's just how you manage it and how you coordinate it and you use your services and social services agencies and how to combat that. But it does work in Toronto. Now, can it work back here again? It's iffy because a lot of residents, a lot of people, the community don't like high rises because it takes away from the beauty, aesthetics from the neighborhood and so forth, more people, more traffic. They don't have a flavor for it anymore like they used to. Mm-hmm. Angela?
Well, I would agree with what you've mentioned, and we're not going to go back in history and rewrite history, right? So, but I do think that there are creative ways to try to bring density into urban settings, and I think it's not just an idea of housing, but it's also again about amenities, about what else is co-located, and how it's not just housing by itself. But I think it also has to work with how people see their living, how people choose to live, and those types of things. So I think the mindset is not just about the mantra around density, but people really changing their mindset about how to live. No one sniffs their nose at transit-oriented development, right? We understand that that's a good thing, right? You're allowed to then not have a car, you can then place all kind of retail around it and those types of things. But that came after a lot of changing of the mindset around what makes for a healthy community. And so I think it's going to have to be working at the people level and at the brain level first to help people understand how things need to be built.
Right.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something. So I was just looking at Ed Glazer's piece on cities and pandemics, which I would kind of recommend. Ed is sort of patron saint of cities. So I think that this, first of all, two things. There is no other model for human development than cities development. That's it. Thousands of years of of history. That's it. We don't do anything else. We build cities. That's how we develop. There isn't any other model. Second, the deviation in performance across cities is much greater than the deviation of density across cities, right? Seoul is reasonably dense. So is Taipei. So is Hong Kong. So is Singapore. If you're telling me that I have to choose between the rights to develop as a person and my rights to be alive, that's not a choice that I'm going to make, right? That is not an acceptable choice. If it's saying that I cannot live and yet I cannot live, that's not, you're not telling me anything. You say I can't develop economically and you're not allowing me to be, to sort of, you're not protecting me from the from the health issues of a city. That's unacceptable. It's just unacceptable. So, that is, and the proof is there. Obviously you can proof a city through dense city for health. That we have 150 years of technology innovations from cholera to thousands of years back to the plague of figuring out how you solve this problem. So the answer is, yeah, you solve the problem, right? You do what it takes. You disinfect, you track, you trace, you build a healthcare system. These are not unrelated problems. It's called underinvestment in public goods. So that's a systemic issue. We got to take this as a wake-up call. It's not just for housing, it's also for health. We're going to have, this is a system that, can produce much better health outcomes than it does. Part of the answer is housing and it is density. Because the one thing I cringe about is every time I open up and I see these articles about somebody opened up went into some, nursing home somewhere and found 6 people dead in a room. It's like, what? That's the consequences of not having density, of nobody checking in, of nobody actually being aware of what's going on with your neighbors. So, end of the day, I have no views on the epidemiology of this, but I got to say, the U.S. is a long way from where it could be on density, and the marginal investment should go to the health, not to sort of trying to, perpetuate a system of economic inequality.
All right. Well, I'm going to take a different question here, combining 2 questions. The question is, Representative Ilhan Omar has introduced the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, which would enforce full payment forgiveness on rents and mortgages nationwide, zero accumulation of debt for renters or homeowners, and zero negative impact on credit ratings or rent. Do you support that act as a necessary emergency measure? And then I guess adding another question that just asks, more broadly, there's an expectation that there could be some coordinated rent strikes. And so, what will be the impacts of that? How will your, organizations handle that?
I think it's premature to find out, to know what that's going to look like. I think HUD right now, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, is working on the CARES Act. I think once we understand and once they provide us additional information on how we look at rent determination, how do we abate some rent and so forth, I think it's much too early right now to understand what that's going to look like. I think that we should be waiting for HUD to respond to that, because if we don't collect rent, we can't operate our developments and so forth. So who bridges that gap? That means we're going to be subsidized on top of subsidizing on top of subsidizing. So I think right now, I think HUD and with our partners, trading association partners are figuring that out. I think we will wait for HUD to give us guidance and so forth, which is coming really quick. And then I think we can answer that question and be in a better position to respond.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think this is the first place I've heard where it's been rent and mortgage. I've heard some local things suggested that it's just about rent. And for me, it's kind of just pushing the can down the block, right? Because you don't pay rent, then you can't pay mortgage, you can't pay for the services that go around, that surround, right, the brick and mortar in itself. And then if you don't pay your mortgage, where does that kick it up to? So I do think it's premature to have that discussion just yet.
Yeah, no particular comments on legislation, unfortunately. That goes way beyond what I can say. But yeah.
All right. Well, here's another question for you then, Jonathan. Some are predicting a decrease in demand for housing in city centers as employers give up their expensive downtown real estate in favor of decentralizing their workplaces. How likely do you think that outcome is? Do you believe that will make housing more affordable in cities?
Well, I mean, I think we're seeing some impacts. Early sort of softening as Airbnbs basically come back on the marketplace. That seems to be something that's happening. Last recession, rentals went down by like 10% or something like that, over the course of 2008 to 2010. On the other hand, I get a lot of emails today from people who are saying, I'm cashed up and ready to buy. So I worry that this is just going to do the same thing that we did back in 2008, 2010, where we killed a lot of multifamily small landlords and small, local people. And welcome BlackRock to your neighborhood, right? So that is the challenge, I think, as we think about the use of our land again. Very simply, one price doesn't clear two markets. And if you've got somebody with a couple $1 billion worth of, money looking to park it somewhere, and that person is competing with, the neighborhood resident on a fixed income, guess who's going to win? That is so I'm not entirely sure how sticky or not. I mean, there'll be some reaction to this, but most of this, there's a reason why real estate was the best investment over the long term in North America, that it was, favored. We've written a tax code and we have, structured a financial system where it encourages people to park their money in real estate. And there's actually very little cost to that, So as we know, when you have something for free, you waste it. So I could house all the homeless people in Los Angeles in the penthouses of Los Angeles today because they're unoccupied. So there are a lot, if you take a look at the nightlife of Vancouver, you can see miles and miles of nothing and nothing, in beautiful buildings which have nobody in them. That's called parking the money. So, I mean, let's kid ourselves. We built a system that works. It works to keep people out of housing and to create empty rooms for people who don't need it.
Do you want to add anything on that, Eugene or Angela?
No, I'm with you on that, Jonathan.
Okay.
I'm with you on that.
Do you think that we need to change what we consider affordable housing when, you know, the traditional ratio had been 30% of your income, and then now we're getting to a place where people are, you know, potentially there's going to be a huge loss of jobs. I mean, 22 million already have filed for unemployment. Who knows if they will stay unemployed long term? Does that shift what we think of in terms of affordable housing, how we define
it? I'll go back to my original statement, Diana. We just don't have a great definition about what affordable housing is.
Yeah.
Each city, each locality has different requirements, so forth. And the lack of resources, just like Jonathan said, 2008, 2010, it seems like it's going to be a repeat here in 2020 and 2021. People who have access to resources are going to do well. People with low income and so forth that don't have access to the resources, they're not going to go anywhere. You know, what Jonathan says about an asset or real estate. People who are low income, who are workforce people who are in renters or maybe some home ownership, they don't have home. Wealth was created by home ownership, not by renters or anything like that. So it just took out, it may take out the millennials. It's surely taking out the low income people from acquiring or getting close to buying a real estate, a home, and so forth. And with this pandemic, I've always told people it's the aftermath. You can get someone in a house, get them all situated and so forth, and 2 or 3 years later, you have a pandemic that you never know where it's coming from. They lose a job, they lose their mortgage and so forth, so they're back at square one all over again. All those people who own homes and back there and lost homes and so forth, got into the mindset, I'm not going to get another home again. I said, I'd rather rent because I don't have to worry about taxes. I don't have to worry about doing my lawn or anything like that. I don't have those headaches anymore. I'd just rather rent, let someone else do it. If there's a clogged in toilet, I just call someone to unclog and so forth. If I own my own home, I have to do all those other types of things. I don't want to do it anymore. It ruins my credit score. I can't ever buy a house again because no one's thinking about the recession or anything like that. So I'm already just messed over. And I seem like there's no pathway to get out of it.
Yeah, I think Jonathan mentioned earlier, and he was doing the statistics for his area where 60% of the people, I guess, are considered low income. I know in Chicago, the area median income is $75,000. 1 out of 4 families make that amount of money. So then when you look at how you dichotomize what is affordable housing, what's considered affordable housing, a misnomer. Eugene mentioned that like 4 times now, right? To who's being actually supported in their housing, it just doesn't match. It doesn't match whatsoever. And so you have a grave deal of people who are going to be losing out. And the more that people are, the incomes are shrinking now and the incomes are going away, that's going to get worse and worse. So there's going to be a greater amount of people who just don't have the ability to access anything. And so I think we have a lot of work to do. I think this shows, it's kind of like, it's not just showing the crack, it's like a dam full of water that's flowing out now that showed where the cracks existed just structurally. And they've been, for lack of a better term, they've been created to be that way already. This just shows even more so the disaster that we have on our hands.
Yeah, I like the analogy there about the cracks and stuff. I'm using a bathtub analogy. It's sort of like, you know, UK, there was a big explosion. There's a lot of water coming out, but you neglect the fact the bathtub already had a lot of holes in it. So you're kind of fill it up, but you know, it's just going to fall out the holes through the holes that much faster. And so, you know, at the end of the day, we're all going to be naked in the tub, and that's uncomfortable. So can we just like fix the holes, please? And stop trying to put the money, just throw money at it, because yeah, we did that before. I mean, that was ARA, that was TARP. I mean, that happened. And you know, and where did we wind up? Well, you know, we wound up with, you know, more homelessness and higher rent burdens and a bigger cost to the economy. I think what we put the numbers on is saying that all of this is a wealth transfer. And the problem is rich people don't spend as much money as poor people do. I mean, there's just a limit to the amount that you can eat. I mean, or how much you can, you know, spend on Netflix every day as you sit in your, you know, on your $150,000, you know, your income. Is you know, it's, if you don't reduce the cost of the rent, then people can't spend it on healthcare, on education, on travel and tourism, on and buying anything. And so you don't get that multiplier for the economy. So it actually is it's a really interesting number. I think the number in LA is something like a I'm probably low on this, $10 to $20 billion annual tax on the economy by having rent burdened households, you know, which is, you know, I'm sure I'm low on that. It's in our report, but that just says, you know, there's a real whole of society trade-off here that we're making. And it's not a good decision. It's a decision that favors people who can get a free ride on the economic activity of the city by essentially staking out territory and calling it their own and watching it appreciate without doing anything else. And in so doing, disadvantaging everybody else access to economic activity and slowing the whole thing down. So at the end of the day, yeah, they're worse off than they could have been, but they don't see it that way.
So I feel like I want to try to come out of this with some ideas of like how we go forward in a positive way. You know, I'm curious to know, one person asked, why, I'm new to housing, why hasn't housing been a political priority? Another person asked, have you seen any efforts to tie affordable housing to increased wages together? You know, are there some new solutions here in terms of how we are, you know, thinking about how to protect our cities from, say, you know, institutional investors who are buying up mass numbers of properties and so on? What can we learn from our, you know, past inabilities to get housing to the top of political priorities, or from other, you know, potentially from other efforts, say, to raise the minimum wage that have been successful? Are there any promising directions that we could take housing policy in, or you know, directions for your own housing authorities that you're working on? What are some, you know, kind of positive directions perhaps that we could end the conversation on?
The sad thing about this, Diana, we've talked to congressional staffers, Congress, till we're blue in the face.
Yeah.
We tell them the dilemma. No one listens to us unless there's a pandemic or something like that. We talk, we say, this is what we need this kind of relief. We need the social services agencies to get their resources and so forth, because it's a combination. We just can't build housing and just say, hey, that's all we have to do. There's a whole lot of other things that we need to incorporate when it comes to putting people in houses and making them affordable, whatever that word is anymore. And they just won't listen. To put it on top of some agenda, either they have to live in public housing, or they have known someone in public housing, or whatever the case may be, but they need a consortium of congressional people who would sit there and say, we're going to take this legislation, take it all the way. I mean, the best way to do this is a stimulus package. Whatever they do, if they do a fourth one, a fifth one, someone should be doing something for housing, for affordable housing. I mean, all the way across the board. If I had a fourth of the budget of the Defense Department and they gave it to us housing authorities, I bet you we'd fix our homelessness. I bet you we'd fix our affordable housing, because we know what to do. We know how fast we have to do it, but we need to cut those the red tape so that we can fulfill those requirements of the city, and also what we're trying to do as a nation to provide housing for everyone across the city and the nation, in this country. We can keep talking, but no one's listening, or some people are listening, but they just won't take it to the next step.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in if that's okay, Angela. I'm very sympathetic what Jean said, and I don't know the politics of all of this. I mean, for anyway, like you guys do. So take it from as an outsider. But you know, we came up with a number saying that California was underbuilt by 3.5 million units back like 3 or 4 years ago. What I was staggered about was the reaction was like, well, that number can't be right because we've never built that much. And like, well, that's why, you know, that's why it's a big number. Because you haven't built that. So, you know, and I don't know if people know this, but most people do. I spent spent time in LA 30 years before that. The last 30 years I've been spending in China. So 3 million units is not a big number. Okay. That's very doable. And so this is a conversation about, will we do it? Not can we do it? And I look out across Los Angeles, I'm hard pressed to count more than 20 buildings that are higher than 4 stories. You know, come on. This is a city of, 4 or 5 million people. What's going on here? And it's not about the earthquakes. Let me tell you, it's really not.
Right.
So clearly is a will issue here. And if we will change our mindset about housing, we can build it. I mean, so, your question of why haven't we done that? Well, I think that's really interesting. There's a complicated history of America and city building and density and race and economic privilege and, tax avoidance, so a lot of reasons. All that's history. We live now, and we've kind of lived out of the easy options. I think historically we tried to get out of this by sprawl. There's always another place to go, slums, and just is also not good. It's kind of the, bury them somewhere and forget about them. That's also not a good answer. But no, we are now, what this is doing is helping us to understand that if we don't hang together, we will hang separately. In the words of Benjamin Franklin, right? So, we do have to just change our mind. And last point, places do this, democratic places. Look at the Netherlands, look at Germany. Right. I mean, and you ask, why did that happen? Well, World War II, right? When you destroy the housing stock, everybody is still there. You need to rebuild it. You come up with a solution, and you come up with one that reflects the values and the economics of the society. We are facing World War II here. We're economically, people are being turfed onto the street daily. I mean, and I don't want to over dramatize it, but this is not a one-off. This is systemic. So, if we want to make a fix to this, we're going to have to step back and do that kind of a shift, saying, this is actually, housing is a right. And so that's going to be the premise. We are going to provide it. So now the question is just, okay, how do you want to do that?
Yeah. I think it was eloquently said by both Jean and Jonathan earlier, but I think it goes back to, like they said, the will. People wanting to do what they want to do. What is the priority here? And so it was really funny because I just noticed in the chat line, somebody said Eugene for president. Once you mentioned 25% for the PHAs, but I will say it's about will. Vote. So vote for those who have the same personal will of where you're trying to go with this. And so that's my silver lining, that we have an opportunity to vote in a few months.
Yeah. All right. I think that leaves me with enough positivity to close up our conversation here. I really appreciate everyone participating. Oh, thank you, NewCities, for the plug. I have a book coming out in October, which is about alternatives to single family home. So it gets at a lot of issues like accessory dwelling units, co-living, multi-generational housing, and a lot around health and housing. It can be bought pre-ordered anywhere like Amazon, IndieWire, etc. And then I think NewCities has some messages to share.
We do. Well, first off, we just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists today for sharing your time and sharing your expertise. That was fantastic. Eugene, we're looking out for those write-in votes for president at this point in time. We want to say thank you to McKinsey Global Institute. This was presented in collaboration with them, and we really, really appreciate that. And we've got, of course, another episode of the Big Rethink coming up next week. It's going to be on the well-being imperative. And one more ask of our audience today, in addition for listening, we'd really appreciate it if you could take 5 minutes, fill in our new survey. We're going to be using your feedback to create relevant and innovative content for the upcoming months. But just a big thank you to everyone today. We hope you have a fantastic day.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.